from NATO 1.0, which was pretty much directed to the Cold War dynamics, from NATO 2.0, which was about the 9/11 and its aftermath, and now NATO 3.0, which is under Donald Trump.
In those days, there were thousands and thousands of foreign troops even in Germany. It was not only Germany itself, but it was Dutch military that was stationed there. It was US forces that were there. It was Canadian forces. It was French forces. So it was a whole group of nations that got together because they thought it was necessary to safeguard the security of not only Germany, but of West Europe altogether.
So I think that there is also a great, demand among people of India to know what NATO can do beyond the Article 5, right? So I think that itself must be a public statement as to what we can do. Thanks.
And I do feel sometimes here in India that there are some misconceptions about NATO, and I think that there is really a good opportunity for us to address them and to discuss them.
The reunification of Germany in 1990, we in Germany were of the opinion this is the end of history for us. This is wonderful. There's no enemy anymore whom we have to be cautious about. You know, part of my own country was the staging ground for Soviet and East German and Warsaw Pact troops. So that meant, to avoid these troops moving into West Germany, that NATO was our backstop for our own security.
Every attempt by any organization in the international system to create a new type of relationship with another organization or a state is an odyssey. It's an exploration. It's an exploration for convergence. And where you find the convergence is in the common interests, in the transnational challenges that cannot be faced alone within national borders.
A very warm welcome to all of you at the second panel of the NATO-India Youth Conference, which is being co-hosted by GEOSTRATA and the Dutch Embassy. This panel is titled as Convergence Among Divergences, and I think nothing really describes the kind of moment that we find when we are speaking about NATO from India and from the perspective of Indo-Pacific better than the title itself. So, what is the India-NATO diplomatic Odyssey? And for elaborating upon how can we find convergences among divergences, and I think a very different history and a very different understanding and analytics as well, I have a stellar panel here. Let me introduce first Dr. Elena Lazaru. She is a Senior Research Fellow and Associate Fellow, Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy at Chatham House. It's a pleasure. We have been together at different panels across Europe, so it's I'm very happy to see you, Elena. Then I have Mr. George Enzweiler, who's Deputy Chief of Mission, Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany, and he is based at New Delhi. Welcome, George. Then I have Ms. Martine Bottheim. She is the Minister, Counsellor, and Deputy Head of Mission, the Royal Norwegian Embassy, and she's also based in New Delhi. And finally, we have Dr. Vivek Mishra. He is the Deputy Director of Strategic Studies Program at the Observer Research Foundation and somebody that has been working on America for quite a few years. So very happy to be here. And with that, let's just start with the first thing. What we can do is that I can perhaps throw a question and then, we can take in no particular order, but we can start from Elena, we can start from George, you can take a call there. But I think what we wish to understand, perhaps, is that not all countries have been at the forefront of NATO's adaptation to modern security challenges, including climate security and hybrid threats. Given India's increasing role in climate diplomacy, what lesson can India and NATO draw from Norway's experience? So, of course, this is to the Norwegian embassy representative here. And I think this is particularly relevant because the strategic concept of 2022 actually takes a very 360-degree approach where it does talk about climate and all of that. So maybe we can start from you.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be with all of you today. My name is Martine. I'm the deputy at the Norwegian Embassy. I'm really happy to be here to talk about NATO, both because I served myself at NATO some years ago, and also because I represent Norway, which is one of the founding members of NATO. And I do feel sometimes here in India that there are some misconceptions about NATO, and I think that there is really a good opportunity for us to address them and to discuss them. So coming to climate change, being in India, of course, India has set really ambitious targets when it comes to combating climate change. India wants to become net zero by 2070, has very, very high ambitions when it comes to renewable. And obviously the defense forces, armed forces, do have large operations, they have large buildings, they really are a factor if nations are expected to meet their national targets. So, and climate change is really, it's a threat multiplier, and it means that climate change, it affects existing problems and it poses security challenges to the armed forces. So it is really crucial that we look at, okay, how can the armed forces contribute, lessen their emissions, and also adapt their planning and their operations to the climate change that we are seeing. How can you conduct military operations in the heat? How can you conduct military operations when the roads are flooded, when installations are flooded? All these questions are the same questions for Norway, for NATO member states, for India. And I really do believe that talking together, exchanging lessons learned, looking at, okay, how do we measure emissions? How do we set the target to reduce emissions? I think these things are topics that we should really discuss to come up with common solutions. For example, when it comes to biofuels, which is something that India has made some also international targets regarding biofuels, the International Biofuel Alliance. In Norway, for example, we have discovered that we can, and we were the first country that did this, we can actually fuel our fighter jets, our F-35, with biofuels. So we use 40% biofuels in the fighter jets. So these kind of experiences, I think, are worthy discussing, learning from each other. And when it comes to NATO, NATO has set a target of becoming the foremost international organizations dealing with climate change and security. NATO collaborates with international organizations, of course the member states, but also partners and other countries in this region. So I really do think that dialogue, exchange on that climate change and security could be very worthwhile for both NATO member states, Norway and India.
Vivek, if it should allow me to come to you, and you've been studying US, of course, and we don't really wish to right now get into the endless debate of what Donald Trump's coming to back to the White House would mean for NATO. I think that's a longer discussion, but what I wish to understand from you is that looking at the specific nature of the Indo-Pacific, which frankly doesn't have a tangible security alliance, what really you think that NATO can bring on the table? Of course, you mentioned climate, etc. You know that, and over the years, NATO has entered into different kind of relationships under its peace partnerships, and also with Japan, South Korea, etc. But from India's perspective, where do you see the convergence being the strongest? There is some convergence, we know. We have our ambitions, but how would you articulate that?
Oh, thank you, Swasti. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me. I mean, don't mind if this chair invariably turns towards Elena. So don't mind if I end up addressing her at the end of this talk. But thank you. The point about the US and NATO, etc., in this region is really important. It's getting more serious, despite the flux that we see in the United States. But in terms of concrete things, there are two ways to look at. One is, of course, the historical idea that the Indian Ocean has been or had been a zone of peace. We've come out of that shell in some ways or the other, given our evolving relationship with the West. So I think it's in a transition phase. But when it comes to NATO, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that there is an element of theaterization of the idea of NATO, which sort of attaches strongly to it, and therefore compels a different vision from the global South, right? I think India's position is important in all these aspects because it brings that nuance where that attachment is sort of diluted, weakened in many ways, and therefore creates a public diplomacy space for NATO, I think. So the ideas that come to my mind start with old trans-boundary issues. For example, cyber, technology, climate, HADR. At some point, although HADR has a strong connotation of joint patrol and military exercises and how you do it. But I thought, if COVID was a perfect storm to test those ideas for other countries. But in terms of capacity building, etc., there is enough space where NATO can step in, and I think we've seen some engagement by NATO of this region strongly, and I think we've come to know from you that you were starting a presence in Jordan. So despite the flux in the Middle East, despite the Indo-Pacific ambiguity in the Indo-Pacific that is continuing on the back of Trumpian policies, I think there is there's an element of certainty underlying all this. So if you look at the Indo-Pacific today, a lot of the policies that are going to come, still a lot of the balls are in the air in terms of what policy and what the approach of the Trump administration is going to be in this direction. So that I think there are two dimensions to it. One is how the transatlantic security itself shapes and how Europe steps up for Ukraine and the overall European security. And the other is how the United States looks at the Indo-Pacific. What are the initial signals that we have seen? We've seen that the 4 Quad countries met on the sidelines after the inauguration. That, I think, was a strong signal. The other is that if you go through the India-US joint statement, they've given a concrete deadline of fall 2025 to strike a deal, a low-hanging or a comprehensive deal for the BTA. Now, what is remarkable to my mind is Trump administration agreeing to a BTA is itself a huge deal. If you look at the MCA, the Mexico-Canada agreement, which he signed and then tore apart, and then still some people think that he will come back to the MCA. So, I mean, the fact that he has agreed to the idea of a BTA compels the idea that the American orientation to the Indo-Pacific is going to remain strong. If you talk to the Europeans, there is enough conviction within Europe that the transatlantic ties will remain solid despite the upheaval. And lastly, I think Trump does not have a grand vision, a strategic vision. He's taking one day at a time, and the immediate compulsion for the Trump administration is to get a ceasefire rolling, whatever nature. So you saw what happened in Ukraine. So I think for NATO, I think there is a diplomatic space that is being created in this part of the world, increasingly now, because we at ORF have engaged NATO for some years now. So I think that there is also a great, I think, demand among people of India to know what NATO can do beyond the Article 5, right? So I think that that itself must be a public statement as to what we can do. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Vivek, because, I mean, frankly, we are living in a space where it is important to understand the evolution of NATO itself, from NATO 1.0, which was pretty much directed to the Cold War dynamics, from NATO 2.0, which was about the 9/11 and its aftermath, and now NATO 3.0, which is under Donald Trump. So this is going to take a very different character. But where Europe goes with its security, I think one major player out there is Germany, of course. And with a change in government there very soon, the incoming chancellor has made it very clear that transatlanticism could be in crisis, and Germany has been getting into several, I would say, unprecedented modernizations. You've also loosened the debt brake and all of that. So where do you see Germany in the European security theater, and how do you think that can give a message to whoever is watching you from the Indo-Pacific about how serious Europe is about its security today?
Let me say thank you, first of all, for inviting me, and it's great to be among so many young people here. It makes me feel a little younger than I am, actually. And unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to serve in NATO or with our mission to NATO in Brussels. But when I was about your age, a little younger, this was still the time of basically the Cold War, the aftermath of the Cold War in the mid-80s. And my country, Germany, was still split in two. There was West Germany, where I grew up, and there was East Germany. West Germany, part of NATO in those days, and East Germany, part of the other big military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. And indeed, you were mentioning that after reunification of Germany in 1990, we in Germany were of the opinion this is the end of history for us. This is wonderful. There's no enemy anymore whom we have to be cautious about. You know, part of my own country was the staging ground for Soviet and East German and Warsaw Pact troops. So that meant to avoid these troops moving into West Germany, that NATO was our backstop for our own security. In those days, there were thousands and thousands of foreign troops even in Germany. It was not only Germany itself, but it was Dutch military that was stationed there. It was US forces that were there. It was Canadian forces. It was French forces. So it was a whole group of nations that got together because they thought it was necessary to safeguard the security of not only Germany, but of West Europe altogether. So in 1990, when the Soviet Union broke apart, basically, the fall of the Berlin Wall, what happened was that this was wonderful. From our perspective, we did no longer need to invest all this money into military hardware. So this was the peace dividend for us. And I remember when I served as, you know, after finishing high school in Germany, military service was compulsory for all young men in those days. And I went to the military, and I think in those days we had about 5,000 big main battle tanks in Germany. You want to take a guess of how many we have now? I think it's around 280, right? So because we thought we are now surrounded only by friends. There's nothing we have to worry about in terms of security. And now we are learning it the hard way that this was perhaps a little over-optimistic, if not to say naive. So what happened yesterday in our parliament, you were mentioning this, is that we have decided, the German parliament has decided to make available a lot of money to rearm in order to be able to deter and secure peace in our continent, which NATO has been the guarantee for over 70, 80 years, basically. And so this is, I think, our perception. There's nothing we would, you know, we are particularly thrilled about. We would be happy if there were there was no war in Ukraine, but we have to face reality, and facing reality means that we have to step up. I think the US has made a valid point that the European pillar of NATO has to be strengthened. We Europeans have to do more, and Germany also has to do more, but I think we're on the right track in that regard.
Well, yes, that's heartening to hear from straight from the horse's mouth, if I may say that. Elena, I have to come to you. You've been working on European security. Of course, you know it very well in and out. I think what we're trying to discuss here is that NATO's role, when we are looking at it from Indo-Pacific and trying to find convergences, of course, we are not looking at Article 5 when we're looking at it from Indo-Pacific. What we are looking at is its capacity to turn out as a net security provider, providing security to the challenges that we face in Indo-Pacific today. Martine did mention how that can be done. She did mention climate. But as NATO as a net security provider for the Indo-Pacific, how would you articulate that?
Thank you very much. It's really nice to see you again. And thank you to the organizers, the NATO Public Diplomacy Division, the Adenauer Stiftung, the Embassy of the Netherlands. Really, it's great to be here. And I'm going to tell you a secret. Every one of us who goes to a lot of these conferences secretly hoping to get invited to the youth part. So it's very good to be here with you today. It's the best. But Chatham House rule, though, that this is a big secret. To your question, I want to take a step back and think about global things for a second. And indeed, as you mentioned, Swasti, I'm with Chatham House in London, and Eliamep in Athens, I'm Greek. But I think this question merits a more global approach. So I'm going to draw back on my past for a second. I used to work in Brazil. I used to head an international relations think tank there. And I want to mention this because I think the response to your question goes straight to the title of this panel. You know, every attempt by any organization in the international system to create a new type of relationship with another organization or a state is an odyssey. It's an exploration. It's an exploration for convergence. And where you find the convergence is in the common interests, in the transnational challenges that cannot be faced alone within national borders. And this is something that is the same across the board. And I say this because I think it's over 10 years ago, I was very happy and lucky to co-organize the first visit of the NATO Defense College to Brazil. And I remember trying to figure out the agenda for that, you know, and you know, you probably and rightly don't know everything about Brazil, although it's India and it's a BRICS country. But one key aspect of Brazilian foreign policy is non-interference, non-alliance. You know, NATO has a reputation that is not necessarily top of what Brazil thinks about as like-minded. And it's 15 years ago, I think, when I'm talking about touch and go, maybe a bit later, maybe 10. And when we sat down to figure an agenda, and this is the kind of thing you sit and you think, maybe there is no agenda of commonality. And then you start thinking of the issues. You start seeing the military, the experts, you know, the bureaucrats, the think tankers. And you think, actually, there's a whole host of things that we do, and we didn't even know that you do these things. And some of these things, you know, are climate security, maritime security, not military, but, you know, piracy, the maritime environment. Now we have other things in the maritime space, like the security of undersea cables, which are not, you know, they're not necessarily military, they're everyday communication, they're energy. You have counter-piracy, counter-trafficking. And these are issues that maybe they don't enter the mental narrative of what NATO does, but it does, you know. And this is the kind of thing that I think, to me, opens a space there to think about these convergences. Now, what is even more important, and now I'm honing in here on India and the Indo-Pacific, is we have had certain global, I would say, developments which feed into the foreign security and defense policy of, I would argue, every single actor in the international environment, which is that this area, the Indo-Pacific, is very important. It always was, but there is a host of issues, including the rise of China, including what I've just mentioned about, you know, cyber security issues, cables, space. There is a whole issue with sort of freedom of navigation and trade, and that's again maritime security, it's also piracy, climate. And if one looks at the successive summits of NATO, and especially I would argue after Madrid, all these issues are part and parcel of what NATO is aiming to do. I mean, now we have China also mentioned in the strategic concept. We have the space domain and the cyber domain included. So these are areas that offer themselves, and from what I know of Indian foreign security policy, which is not my area, but they're very important also. And you know, the technology dimension, the climate dimension, the maritime dimension, and the space dimension, all of which I would say are dual use, but where you have NATO very much involved, I think they offer themselves here in this area. And I would give as an example, and I finish here, I was going recently through a list of sort of companies that were awarded by DIANA, which is the NATO's Defense Innovation Accelerator. It selects companies that have potential in emerging and disruptive technology. And one of them was on space technology, which is actually there to monitor environmental changes, but can have applications in defense. So these kind of things, I think they're really there to offer themselves.
Thank you, Elena. And I mean, this is just my second, so to say, round with all of you. But here, I think I would like to understand from each one of you, what do you think NATO can really bring on the table when it comes to capacitation? Because for sure, we understand that this is not for membership. This is for building more capacity. And one of the things I think also for the many young people here, they should know is that one of the things that, you know, there is in Helsinki is a hybrid center for excellence, which is EU and NATO-led center, which is critical for protection of critical infrastructure and subsea cables, etc. Because Baltic Sea has been pretty much a theater of grey zone warfare. It's just that we don't in India follow that very much, but there is a lot of wealth of, I would say, experience, knowledge, technology that both the EU and NATO can bring. But that's my point. I would also like to go back in the same order, maybe starting from Martine, about what do you think are the top 3 or 4 capacity building, capacitation programs that NATO can bring to the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, thank you so much. With regard to the hybrid threats that you were raising, I think that's something that, at least in Norway, we see that we are experiencing more of these kind of threats, and that these kind of threats will be more demanding to handle in the future to come. I think in Norway, we do know that Russia especially seek to deter our support to Ukraine using physical, digital sabotage and threats of use of nuclear weapons. And these threats are, of course, meant to create uncertainty, unrest, fear, and it is an attack on our democracy. And we know that China as well is doing the same in Norway. And these hybrid threats this year, I mean, they have been the topic of many international conferences, the World Economic Forum, the Munich Security Conference, and these last days, this was also a topic that was being discussed in Raisina. And I think that one message which is clear from all those discussions is that we need a very holistic approach on how to deal with these kind of hybrid threats. And I believe that democracies, I think that's, you know, a crucial point where we want to start when we discuss NATO. NATO is really a membership organization for democracies who wants to defend democracies. So I believe that democracies like Norway, like all the member states of NATO, like India, can come together and can discuss these threats because we need a holistic, we need a new approach on how to deter and how to react on these. And I think that that's really something that it's worth having a dialogue about.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful ideas. Vivek, if I can come to you, and not just about capacitation, of course, I'm going to ask you about that, but because we are in the center of the Indian Ocean region, the Indo-Pacific theater, and the center of so much action. Vivek, apart from the fact that NATO can bring a lot on the table, technologically, etc., but there continue to be challenges as well. So in your remarks, could you also tell, because ORF also has been at the forefront of the NATO-India, dialogue, which is supported this year, it was CAS, and what are the challenges? I would also like to understand from you.
Let me start with the challenges. I think what needs to be mentioned here is, of course, the India-Russia ties. That's the foremost, element of the fact that we talk about NATO-India relationship. Now, within that, there is a ground shift there already. The first of which is that during the Biden administration, the India-Russia relationship was really stress tested. And it stood the test of time. That pressure is going to wean off, is going to decrease under the Trump administration if there is a US-Russia reset, at least from this, the vantage point that we are at, it looks like. So that's always going to be a challenge. What is the agreement that the United States reaches with Ukraine? What is the nature of what are the tenets of that agreement, will really spill over to NATO's engagements in other areas, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Now, given that Russia itself has, it doesn't call it the Indo-Pacific, but it has an Eastern Pacific vision of the world. This second thing is that how NATO evolves after this. I mean, NATO is also at a cusp in many ways. How NATO evolves and what are the components of its apolitical and non-strategic readaptation is really going to define the threads of the relationship to the Indo-Pacific. Because clearly the overtones of a of a military re-engagement with the Indian Ocean will be something that I think the countries of the Indian Ocean itself will be very uncomfortable with. And I don't think the NATO itself is at a position where it says that it wants to do so. If there is a strong element, let's say in the next 10 decades, if there is a strong military or strategic element to NATO's engagement to the Indo-Pacific, it'll perhaps start with the Pacific theater and not the Indian Ocean theater. So those are the challenges, to my mind, that I think will be stress tested. But a lot of it depends on the externalities of what's happening along the transatlantic relationship.
Yeah, fair point. Ultimately, I think that is going to be pretty much a litmus test of where things are going in the future. George, what are your thoughts on how NATO can truly build capacity for the vulnerable states or the vulnerabilities that you see in the Indian Ocean region?
Well,
and also the Indo-Pacific, I'm sorry, not just the Indian Ocean.
Well, let me just first say that the Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean region, India, China, Japan, other countries of South Asia, Southeast Asia, are hugely important for European countries, for Germany in particular. We are a nation that depends on trade, on the free flow of goods. So it's quite logical that German interest, and probably also in more general terms, European interest, is to safeguard the freedom of the seas. You know, we are in the Dutch residence here. Hugo Grotius is the, so to say, the father of international law. And I think one of his main works was Mare Liberum, the freedom of the seas. And so to protect this, I think, is not solely in German or European interest, but in the interest, for example, of India as well as of many other countries. So I think this is a common interest of all countries, democracies that are interested in preserving, upholding the international order, the prohibition of the use of force, the upholding of international law, maritime law, etc. I think the question of and how far NATO has, could be interesting for India very much depends on India. I think NATO itself would have a lot to offer in various sectors, but I think it's an open club basically. I mean, we're not talking obviously about membership, but one of the very few positive things came out of the Ukraine-Russian war is that all of a sudden countries that have been neutral for decades, like Sweden, decided to join NATO, or Finland, for example. They don't do this because they think it's just nice to be a member of NATO, but because there's a threat perception that has changed because of the war. And now, this is for India to decide in how far India should choose to work together with NATO, with European countries, with the US. I think there's a lot of interest, for example, in the Indo-Pacific 4, in Japan and Korea, in Australia and New Zealand. There's a serious threat perception vis-a-vis the rise of China. The North Koreans send missiles into the Pacific every couple of weeks, I'd almost say. So these are concerns that both European NATO countries take seriously, as well as countries in the Indo-Pacific take seriously. So I think there's a lot of convergence in our interests in that respect, but it's basically up to India, up to each and every country in how far we want to engage. I would think that, this does pose probably some challenges for Indian foreign policy. How do you reconcile these ideas with strategic autonomy, with the good relations to Russia? What does that actually mean? And is it good to be perhaps over-dependent on Russian military hardware? I seem to think that this has changed over the last couple of years slightly. So I think it very much is in Indian hands to see where we can work together. I think NATO will be very open in all aspects.
So from the Indian perspective, of course, you do see, I'm sure all of us notice that there has been a shedding of past inhibitions in many ways. India has formally joined, one could have not imagined it a few years ago, but India has formally joined the CMF. Led by the US in 2023, although in a limited sense, we are not there for any offensive things. But I think when you say it depends on India, I think my opinion is that perhaps it would be more comfortable for India if these kind of maneuvers or these kind of engagements are EU-led and NATO-backed instead of NATO-led. So I think that's perhaps the Indian strategic comfort. But then I definitely have to come to Elena for her ideas on where does she see that the real capacity building can happen. And also from the European side, I think EU and NATO are not, I mean, they don't work in silos, certainly not in the Indo-Pacific. Or do you think it's a completely siloized approach to Indo-Pacific?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, just to the last question, it's really not what I think. It's a fact that if one looks at the 3 successive joint EU-NATO declarations and the current plans underway, you can see. Well, you know, it's not necessarily about the mention to the Indo-Pacific, but the issue areas. They are definitely areas with a wider reach, and that is also including the issues we've discussed that concern the Indo-Pacific. And then I would argue also that if one monitors, as I said, the evolution of the strategic concept and, you know, NATO's objectives, and then the EU strategic compass and the more recent documents that we've had. Yesterday we had the presentation of the EU white paper on defense, which is mostly industrial and financial, but you do have elements of, you know, the perception of global threats. I mean, clearly there is an alignment on those issues. Indo-Pacific has become part and parcel both of the outreach of NATO, but the outreach of the EU. If you see, the EU has an Indo-Pacific strategy in the last few years, which it did not have before. The Netherlands actually having been part of the initial, you know, there was one Indo-Pacific strategy by the Netherlands before there was of the EU. It's one of the originals. But so the issues, I think, are there. And then we cannot forget, of course, the convergence of membership, which, you know, I mean, we cannot pretend it's not there, that you have so many EU member states now, even more with the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, that are part. So, of course. But I want to go to the question of, you know, the capacity to do more with India for NATO, because, you know, I think we should not forget, sometimes we start from the top and we think about the highest level. But I think the real capacity and partnership building begins with trust. And when you start with this trust, where do you find this trust? Well, first of all, you find it in building this 1.5 track to diplomacy, you know, the think tanker to think tank, the think tanker to government official, the experts, the youth, the NGOs. So I think there is a lot to explore there, and fora like this, they explore it. So I definitely think this generation of idea and the leaders of tomorrow, you know, this is something we should really mention as a first step, the public diplomacy. So that's one thing. Secondly, I would say that the trend, and there again, the EU is doing this, but also NATO, is in examining tailored potential with each, with partners. And the EU is now underway, has launched this new model of security and defense tailored partnerships. Here in the Indo-Pacific widely, there is Korea and Japan already. But, you know, as I mentioned Latin America before, well, it's important to remember that the NATO-Colombia relationship also is of a very tailored nature. So I think, you know, this kind of tailored approach, which involves a lot of consultation, I think that is a very good mechanism. And then finally, as I said, I'm remaining here on the softer issues, but I think they are the basis for the beginning of this kind of global engagement. We've come, some of us, from the Raisina dialogue these days, and you know, it cannot be overlooked, I think, the relevance of India for innovation in technology, and how that also has entered very much the EU and the NATO security and defense sort of list of key objectives to explore partnerships in innovation, technology, and dual use. And I think looking into that more could be a basis.
Oh, that was a wonderful session, but I still have a few minutes for questions from the audiences. So I'll just take 3 questions in no particular order. Please introduce yourself, maybe with the lady one, and yeah. And keep the questions, please, brief, because we have to wrap in just another 4 or 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. Am I audible? Thank you to the panelists for a very insightful discussion. I am Dr. Shreya. I'm working as a research associate at the Vivekananda International Foundation. My question is slightly outside of the Indo-Pacific. It is more about the Europe and USA relationship. With recent developments, with Trump pausing military aid to Ukraine and J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference and all the aftermath, how the European leaders have been responding to Trump's diplomacy towards Europe, we cannot deny the fact that Europe does need to boost its defense spending in the NATO, but at the same time, historically, it has really relied on the USA for its security provisions. So how do you see this transatlantic relationship going towards a new chapter, and what role do you think NATO has to play in this new chapter of transatlantic relationship? Thank you.
Who was your question addressed to?
Whichever from the panelists can answer.
Right.
Thank you.
So can we just collect the 3 questions and so that we can buy them? All right, the second one. Yes, please.
Can I take this one? Thank you. My name is Kevin Bayer. I work in the European Parliament, and we were speaking on the panel earlier. So I would like to address a question to the Norwegian representative. You were touching already on the border you are sharing with Russia, and also with threats you're facing. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit, what does it mean in everyday life, or what kind of threats are these? Because attending a Raisina dialogue for 3 days, one of many questions which I faced was always, what's actually the problem? So maybe you can give some insights as a NATO founding member sharing a border.
Yes, I think Indians do need to understand what really is your problem. Why are you fighting these wars? Yes. The third one and the last one. Yes, please introduce yourself. Please.
Good afternoon, sorry. My name is Samvat. I am a second year at Jindal Global University. My question is directed to the panel as a whole. For most of my peers right now, the most flux-making change that NATO did go through was the status of Poland emerging as somewhat of a tactical vanguard of NATO's efforts against Russia. Because there is representation from a lot of diverse NATO partners, just wanted to know how that change in the remilitarization, if I may call it, of Poland is affecting regional differences, dialogues, and interests. Thank you.
Thank you. So in no particular order, but please feel free and please be brief because everybody is hungry.
Well, maybe I can address not the Norwegian question, but rather the question that the lady was asking with regard to US and European relations within NATO and whether that's changed. I think it's almost a watershed moment. At least this is, I think, currently the feeling in Europe. I think the US is basically right, and you are right, that we have relied mainly on US security for many decades, and it's time to do more for us Europeans. I think this is fair to say. This is also a question of burden sharing. I think from the US perspective, it may also be connected to the question that there are other regions besides Europe that are becoming more and more important with the rise of China. This is the Indo-Pacific, obviously. So I think that's an important thing. I think this is a wake-up call for Europe, but I think Europe is actually stepping up to the table.
Yes, and I fully agree, of course, with George, and Europe is stepping up, Norway is also stepping up, and NATO will remain a very important factor for Norway's defense also in the future. When it comes to how we do experience these hybrid threats in our everyday lives in Norway, I must say that I've been living in India the last 4 years, so I have myself not experienced them, but I do know, of course. For example, now, all my friends, all my families, they do have an emergency storage at home in case of anything happening. This is something that I've never experienced, I never heard of. We do experience cyber attacks. Our parliament was attacked. The servers of our parliament was attacked 2 years ago, and it was attributed to Russian actors. We do experience it in terms of criminal activities in our universities, infiltrating amongst our researchers. We do experience it in terms of disinformation. A lot of disinformation is being planted in Norwegian media, on social media. For example, regarding Norwegian children welfare systems, there is a lot of disinformation about that across the world, coming from actors who want to create a bad image, who want to spread lies about Norwegian society. So we do experience it in many aspects of our everyday lives. And of course also in terms of budgets, that is huge. You know, we now need to prioritize defense. We want to prioritize education, we want to prioritize health, welfare for the people, but we are now obliged to prioritize defense. Thank you.
Elena, would you like to come? I'll come to Vivek for the concluding remarks or for the rise of Poland.
Yes, well, just one word on the first question, if I may, just to add my own confirmation of the watershed moment, and to say, you know, yesterday we had the white paper on defense, which I mentioned, but also last week, the announcement of the Rearm Europe initiative by the Commission. And, you know, this is actually, when one adds the various financial modalities there, it's 800 billion for 4 years added on to EU defense spending. And EU defense spending as a whole is about 340 billion last year, and that's a huge increase actually from years before. So if you consider that and then do the math, I think actually it's quite substantial to think, you know, that the 800 billion for 4 years, when already the full budget is 340 billion for a year. So I think that in itself speaks to that, watershed moment is a very nice expression, but, you know, the money speaks, I think, as well, and the determination. To the point about Poland, I wanted to put in a very good, very quick Greek perspective, which is, I think, the role Poland has taken on, I think, for NATO allies and EU partners alike, creates a lot of space for new synergies. And from my Greek perspective, you know, the Greek-Polish relationship in the field of defense, including with a joint proposal for the air defense shield, you know, it speaks to how this creates space, because that relationship was not, that there as much before.
Vivek, your concluding remarks.
The last question I want to be answering is what's happening in transatlantic security when you have three other Europeans here. Just to weigh in quickly, it's seismic, right? I mean, what's happening? But also there is a trend that, you know, the chips are falling after the initial Munich security, Vance's speech, or after other events. You see that there is an adaptation already in the European narrative to step up, and I think most of the arguments are now saying that it's a good feedback, But the last thing I want to say is that the security arc, that the transatlantic security arc that the Europeans are trying to create is a long one. What is concerning is what happens in the immediate term, right? And particularly in terms of Patriot and other things. Thanks.
So the key takeaway of this panel, perhaps, is that the Trump bill, no matter how painful in the short term, is going to be beneficial in the long term, not only for Europe, but also for Indo-Pacific, as well as for NATO. I think that has been the key takeaway. It was an honor to moderate this brilliant panel, and thank you once again for the opportunity.